So APV, don't forget that little acronym right there. Active listening is the A part, and that involves looking in her direction, nodding as she is talking, and also, I should have put this first, you stop what you're doing. So the active listening piece, you stop what you're doing, get off the computer, put your phone down, whatever you're doing, you stop that. You look in her direction, and you nod as she talks. So that's A. The next one was P, which is for paraphrase. And paraphrase simply means repeat in your words. You're going to repeat what she said briefly in summary fashion using your words. And the reason that the paraphrasing piece is important is because sometimes, I'm not necessarily accusing anybody in here of doing this, but sometimes you perhaps gave her the illusion that you were listening. And later on, she found out that you really weren't listening and that you didn't get it. So if you paraphrase back using your words what she said, that by default means you must have gotten the message, because you wouldn't be able to run it through your filter if you hadn't got the message. Now, if you say, well, honey, what I hear you saying is blah, 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 and she goes, no, that's not what I'm saying, then you can ask her to, well, would you mind rewording that then so I can get it? And then she can reword it, and then you can paraphrase it again. And then she'll go, yeah, that's what I mean. So that's the P in APV. And then there's the validation, which simply means I respect, I understand. So that's the validation piece. And you can even say, okay, well, I understand what you're saying, and I respect the fact that that's your truth. And that is validation. You can throw in there if you want, depending on how safe it is and how much she receives or doesn't receive this next line. You can say, that's not necessarily the way I see it, but I'm not here to defend my opinion or to mount a defense or to make you wrong. I'm here to understand your side of things. So let me repeat all of this again. And this was a long way around the bush to kind of tie in to answer Tim's question about, is it okay to fake empathy? She seems to want emotional mirroring. Okay, emotional mirroring is not part of this formula. There's just three components: the active listening, the paraphrase, and validation. So I'm going to summarize this. Emotional mirroring is not in here, but it doesn't matter because this still is, she wants emotional reciprocity. So if you do APV, she's getting emotional reciprocity, and you don't have to fake it. So she's talking, you're going to stop what you're doing, you're going to look in her direction and nod. That's the active listening. Then you're going to paraphrase back what she said using your words. The reason that's important because now she will know that A, he listened to me, and B, he understood what I said because he just used his words to say what I said. You wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't get it. And then thirdly, there's validation, and that is, okay, honey, I understand what you're saying, and I respect that that's your perspective on it. That's not necessarily how I see it, but I'm not here to defend my opinion. I'm here to understand your opinion on it. That is validation. And this APV business is by default a very staunch form of empathy. Hey guys, this is Mark with AdultAspergersChat.com, and I wanted to answer this question: why is it that my husband on the autism spectrum never considers my point of view? He always has to be right, and I'm always irrational and overly emotional according to him. So just understand that your husband has autism, for crying out loud. Autism. Okay, not an allergy or something like that. It's a neurocognitive disorder that affects many areas of functioning. This could include difficulty with basic understanding of rules of society, especially if these rules are not obvious. There's a lot of hidden rules. Some are written, some are spoken, and some are learned through observation and intuition. He doesn't have intuition like you do. So a person on the autism spectrum has difficulty understanding social cues. He has difficulty with implied directions. He is a visual learner in a verbal world, and he has difficulty reading between the lines. You, as a neurotypical spouse, can do all of this stuff naturally and intuitively. You don't have to even think twice about it. Your husband with autism, he learns facts. He learns facts. He does not take in all of what is happening around him that involves the rest of the world, only what directly impacts him. He's not taking in the stuff that happens around him. He only takes in the stuff that impacts him. So your husband has probably had many conversations that have generally been about knowledge, facts, figures, and whatnot, but not about feelings and interactions. Emotions and emotional reciprocity are foreign to him, especially if he has some mind blindness issues or some alexithymia. So as a result, he does not really know how the social world works and what one is supposed to do in various socially tricky situations. And guess what is the most socially trickiest situation? Being with you, the NT wife. So the being in the dark about what to do in socially tricky situations can apply to even the smallest situations that you, his wife, may take for granted. Not knowing the unspoken rules of situation causes anxiety with him, which leads to many of the behavioral problems that you witness as your husband tries to impose his own sense of order on the world he doesn't fully understand. So your husband creates if he is typical of other people on the autism spectrum, he literally creates his own set of rules for everyday functioning to keep things from changing and thereby minimizing his anxiety. He has mind blindness, he has alexithymia. This creates a lot of unpredictability, and unpredictability creates a lot of anxiety. So to reduce his anxiety, he's going to create as much predictability as possible. So that means he does not want change, especially surprise changes. He wants a lot of routine and structure. So sometimes he just makes up the rules when it's convenient. Other times he attempts to make them up by looking for patterns. Rules are the logic of a situation to make it less chaotic for him and more predictable and understandable. So if there are no rules for an event or situation, if your husband is typical of the run-of-the-mill autistic brain, he will create his own rules from his own experiences based on what he has read, seen, or heard. He will often have a great deal of information to use in reaching his conclusions and forming his opinions. So as a result, some of his conclusions are correct, some of them are wrong. So your husband will rarely consider your point of view if he does not consider you to be knowledgeable on the topic in question. And most of the things that you bring up with him, he does not view you as an expert, so therefore your opinions on a particular matter may be disqualified. So if you can't or don't provide facts, that's how he thinks, facts, not emotions. So if you can't or don't provide facts and evidence that back up your opinion will mean nothing. And so he will argue with you about your opinions if they're different from his, and he may even download your differing opinion as criticism. So he thinks that his opinion is more logical, so he chooses his opinion. And he probably may view you as illogical, overly emotional. And honestly, that does represent rigid thinking on his part, which is a trait of autism. We could say in general that the person on the autism spectrum finds it difficult to be flexible, finds it difficult to consider alternative views, especially if he's already reached a conclusion. So new ideas can be difficult to accept. He may say something along the lines of, I'd rather do it the way I've always done it. And so being forced to think differently can cause a lot of anxiety. So never overestimate your autistic husband's understanding of a situation based on his high intellectual ability and his other strengths, because in most other domains of life, he appears perfectly normal and probably excels. And so you would think, well, if he does so great at work and if he's like the smartest guy over there and he's an engineer or a computer scientist, and I mean, he does really well. How come he doesn't get the social stuff? Because ASD is a developmental disorder. Developmentally, his social emotional brain is stunted. So he's going to understand logic, facts, figures. He's going to be task-oriented. He's going to want to work with objects and things, not so much people. He's someone who has not fully figured out how the social world works. He's not figured out how the emotional world works. And he could use a roadmap, quite honestly, and a set of instructions on how to deal with some intricate social things and the emotional intricacies that go along with a romantic relationship or a marriage. That's where you come in, the compassionate coach. He's probably smarter than you on many levels, but when it comes to social emotional stuff, he's more like a 14-year-old. That sounds like an exaggeration. It's not. So you could become a compassionate coach and help him with his blind spots, which they will always be in the social and emotional realm of things. So when you have tried to talk to your husband on the autism spectrum about relationship issues, have you found that he just viewed you as being critical and putting him down and making him feel like he's to blame for all the problems? It's all his fault. If your husband on the autism spectrum is similar to most of the other men that I work with, he has grown up being told that he's not behaving properly and that he has been disapproved of numerous times by parents, teachers, and even peers. So he grew up knowing that he wasn't quite meeting others' expectations, and as a result, he now as an adult is very hypersensitive to perceived criticism. I say perceived criticism because oftentimes people are not purposely being critical, but he perceives it as such. And even constructive criticism or neutral feedback can download as criticism to him today because he has been conditioned, and that's the magic word, he has been conditioned from childhood to receive any type of feedback and view it as criticism. So now you, the NT wife, come along in his life, and he is perhaps not being emotionally reciprocal or displaying intimacy and empathy in the way that you want. And so you, being the loving, caring person that you are and valuing the marriage like you do, you want to fix the relationship, and you approach him in a way, and guess what? Your message downloads to him as yet another parental reprimand. He views you as a parent who is yet again disapproving of his behavior, and he's going to accuse you of blaming him, of being critical of him, and making him to believe that he's not good enough. So by virtue of a lifetime of voiced disapproval from others, he is literally programmed to perceive criticism. When you begin the sentence like, "We need to talk," or "I have an issue that I need to discuss with you," he instantly predicts that he will be criticized. He expects it, he looks for it, and as you're talking, he's mounting a defense. He's not listening to what you have to say. And then after dozens and dozens and dozens of failed attempts on your part to get him to understand your perspective, your feelings, and so on, you know that it's not likely you're going to get anywhere with him. You know that when you voice your hurts and anger, he's going to do a version of meltdown or shutdown or just adult temper tantrum, and you're not going to get anywhere in the way of conflict resolution or problem solving. And so you walk away from that argument disappointed yet again, and after this happens for several years, you are now conditioned for disappointment. In other words, you go into a discussion already predicting that it's not going to turn out very well. So now we fast forward years into the relationship. He's conditioned for criticism, you're conditioned for disappointment, and the problems go unresolved and just pile up in the closet. So you're dealing with a man who has super low self-esteem, is hypersensitive to criticism, and will view even some of your neutral comments as criticism. So what do we do with this situation? Wordage is super important. It's important for you to word things in a way that doesn't convey disapproval. And I would be more than happy to help you with that. I have groups. This is a relatively easy problem to solve. The links are below. Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAsperger'sChat.com, and today I want to talk about impaired social interaction in people on the autism spectrum, and this may help you understand why you don't get the emotional reciprocity that you need, want, and desire from your spouse on the spectrum. So there's various theories as to why people on the autism spectrum have impaired social skills. Some researchers suggest that poor social skills can be caused by a weakness or an absence of the social gaze response, and we'll talk about that here shortly. It may be caused by sensory distractions, which prevent the person from concentrating on social issues. Could be caused by memory dysfunction. For example, deficits in memory for faces and common social scenes, which prevent the person from remembering other people or events. It could also be caused by failure to develop a theory of mind, which prevents the person from understanding what other people are thinking or feeling. And lastly, it might be caused by failure of affective processing. Affective processing simply means being able to understand one's emotions and perhaps the emotions in others. So people on the autism spectrum, with respect to social interactions, have difficulty with social responses. Specifically, they tend to be inflexible, they tend not to understand context, and they tend to have difficulty generalizing. So let me explain this in more detail. The relationship between social interactions and proper social responses are flexible, context-dependent, and generalizable. For example, general and unspoken social rules are supposed to govern how a person responds when he or she meets someone for the first time. But the specifics of the meeting are never precise and depend on the context. For example, whether the new acquaintance is a neighbor, a teacher, a classmate, a coworker, etc. Another example would be, let's say, family members get together for a family reunion, okay? So there's no doubt going to be handshakes, hugs, and kisses, but exactly how tight a hug will be, or exactly where a kiss will be planted, or exactly what people will be talking about is both variable and context dependent. Neurotypicals can intuitively interact with others in a way that is flexible. Variability does not throw them off. They understand the context of the social event, and they can generalize from one event to another event. But people on the autism spectrum have difficulty in these areas. The subtle nuances in relationships are difficult. So what does the individual on the spectrum do instead? They tend to learn things, especially social things and emotional things, by rote memory. The person's style of learning is such that he or she will try to store each social experience by rote memory. A strong aptitude for rote memory is a typical cognitive tendency among people on the autism spectrum. For example, these individuals may demonstrate the ability to repeat the script of an entire movie verbatim, or recall specific dates that nobody else is even considering. However, this capacity for strong rote memory may also be accompanied by challenges in simple recall. For example, you may have talked to your spouse earlier one morning and you asked him to do something, and then 2 or 3 hours later, you asked him if he followed through. He said no, and I don't even remember what you asked me to do. Yet he may be able to mention all of the generals in the Civil War, for example. So while rote memory helps one retain data and facts, it doesn't help with gauging the give and take aspects of social interactions. Without extracting complex social cues from multi-dimensional social interactions, the person on the autism spectrum can't effectively use the stored information to generalize to new related social situations. The best that person can do is to follow rigidly the memory entry that best matches the current situation as a script. Many of you have heard of Temple Grandin. She's an autistic author, and she wrote about how she handled social situations better as she got older because she accumulated more examples in her visual library and could find a better match to each social situation. Here's another example of the business of using rote memory. Since social responses tend not to be flexible, context dependent or generalizable in the person on the autism spectrum. Let's say, for example, we have a college student, and we have, in this case, he or she is a neurotypical, and so this person is sitting in class, and so by observing his professor's behavior, which is called gaze attention, the non-autistic or neurotypical student is usually able to predict the professor's intentions. For example, what the teacher is going to do next, what he might say next, and so on. So as a result, this student may get a pencil and piece of paper from his desk. He may raise his hand to ask a question. He may open a certain textbook, or simply sit quietly without taking any action. Exactly what will happen is variable and depends on the context. For example, whether the professor is writing something on the blackboard, is looking at the group of students with her arms crossed, or has moved from her desk to the classroom exit. Conversely, the autistic student, by virtue of a rote learning style, attempts to store each instance separately and precisely and fails to extract the ambiguous, context-dependent relationship between the professor's body language and her intention. Now, I had mentioned earlier that one reason for poor social skills may be a weakness or absence of the social gaze response. Now, what people on the autism spectrum tend to do instead of that is gaze aversion. So compared to neurotypical people who look at others' faces, especially the eyes, people on the autism spectrum do this much less frequently, and that's called gaze aversion. So one reason for their gaze aversion is that the relationship between facial expression and the other person's feelings or motives is hard for the person to comprehend. One of the traits of autism is difficulty understanding facial cues, body language, how tone of voice and volume of voice changes the context. So if the person can't glean nonverbal information provided in facial expressions, then he or she will be less interested in looking at the faces of others, which further reduces his or her chance of gleaning important nonverbal information in social interactions. Another reason for gaze aversion is that the human face is very complex. It's a dynamic stimulus that may overload the sensory sensitivities of the person trying to observe the other's behavior. And this makes it very difficult to read another person's facial expressions, body language, and so on. So it is for these reasons that your spouse on the autism spectrum has impaired social interaction. And unfortunately, in the NT's mind, this often downloads as he is selfish, insensitive, uncaring, self-absorbed, even narcissistic. And I'm not saying that none of that happens ever, but a good 80% of what's going on here is simply this business of not instinctively and intuitively and naturally getting into the flow, especially the emotional flow of social interactions. So your neurotypical wife is wired in her own particular way, specifically for nurturing, for love, for connection. And she is also by nature, given that she has hard wiring in her to potentially be a mother someday, and possibly she currently is a mother, she can also be highly protective of her loved ones. And so when she is in this case with a husband on the autism spectrum who mostly unintentionally is emotionally unavailable, then this disconnection fires a danger pathway. In other words, in her brain, there is a mechanism that alerts her that there is something to fear. In this case, fear of abandonment, rejection, disconnection. And so some of the behaviors that you witness in your NT wife are the result of fear of this disconnect. And how that looks is oftentimes anger. So when she is angry, lecturing, arguing, even threatening, when she is parental, when she is agitated with some of the things that you say and do, or maybe she's upset with some things you're supposed to be doing or saying and you don't, all of that to you looks like nagging and a source of stress, and you want to separate from that. And you do in the version of a shutdown or meltdown, which in the end is just more disconnection, which then reinforces her fear of abandonment, which then reinforces her need to connect, to reconnect. It's not an exaggeration to say that if she has experienced years and years of what she would call emotional deprivation, there is this low-grade chronic fight or flight response operating at all times. So now she has this steady drip, drip, drip of adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, cortisone, and all of these other fight or flight chemicals, which basically results in chronic anxiety. And it operates at such a low level that it may not even be noticeable in her and could be operating at a very subconscious level. But unfortunately, with years and years of being in this situation where the danger pathway is being fired in her brain, and she's getting these little tinges of alert and alarms going off that something is wrong, it begins to manifest in physical symptoms. So after a while, the emotional pain will result in physical pain. So if your NT wife is experiencing some physical ailments currently, most notably autoimmune disease, then it's a pretty good indication that she has some emotional turmoil playing in the background chronically. So on those occasions when she appears to be verbally attacking you, she's being verbal, no doubt. It's not necessarily an attack against you, but when it appears that way, know that her danger neural pathway that operates in her brain is firing at its loudest. So perhaps you can muster up a little bit of compassion and understanding for your NT wife and realize that her complaining behavior and her anger is not something against you per se. It's her way to deal with this fear of abandonment, disconnection, lack of love, lack of intimacy, lack of emotional reciprocity. It is literally a defense mechanism that manifests as a result of the danger pathway being ignited. To put it a different way, she feels unsafe, she feels vulnerable and exposed, and these behaviors that you witness that are undesirable to you are her best attempt to regain security, intimacy, emotional reciprocity, love, connection, and bonding. Okay, well, with respect to meltdowns, sometimes they're shutdowns, sometimes they're adult temper tantrums. It would be good to think in terms of prevention rather than intervention, because most of the time, and I'm speaking in generalities here, we'll use the example of the man with ASD, when he's already in the throes of something that, and by the way, it's always anxiety-based. It would be good to think in terms of prevention, because once the individual with ASD is already triggered, you're just going to have to write it out at that point, because it's all anxiety-based. Whenever gets angry, you can be assured that what you're seeing is the anger, but what's underneath the anger is anxiety. And the anger is nothing more than an anxiety reduction technique. And so when gets angry, he's already been triggered, and it's going to be really hard to put that bullet back in the gun at that point. And I'm not saying that intervention is never a usable strategy, but it's certainly the hard route to go, and it's going to be highly ineffective a lot of the time. So the best thing to do is think in terms of prevention. And so what he could begin to do, if he would be willing, would be to start a trigger journal. And I don't think it would be a 100-page journal, because I find that most of the time whoever he is, there's usually a finite set of triggers, and there's a huge crossover. So you might think, well, he gets triggered by this, and this. But if you look a little deeper, you realize that a lot of those things are the same thing. And so he probably only has 3 to 5 triggers. I'm going to make up some examples. simple examples that you can wrap your brain around. Maybe a hectic, chaotic, noisy environment would be one. Maybe being hit by surprises by his NT wife who charges in there and says, oh, well, we need to do this now. When he's over here doing his own thing, minding his own business, and then she charges in there, now he's supposed to stop what he's doing and tend to whatever she wants. So unwanted interruption might be another example of a trigger. Coming home from a hard day at work and you're beat, and he just wants to go somewhere by himself and de-escalate a little bit and kind of charge his battery, because social situations drain his battery. And so if he comes home from a difficult day at work, his battery's dead, and he may need some time alone just to recharge a little bit before he tries to get involved with the family in conversation or whatever. Those are just 3 easy examples. And so the first thing you'd want to do is come up with a trigger journal, and then part of that journal then would be some alternative choices. So instead of, trigger 1 is this, and what I usually do when I get triggered that way is I yell at my wife. First of all, you'd want to identify when the trigger happens, because then you'd have a propensity to get angry. So you would want to come up with something. Okay, maybe instead of yelling at my wife, I could simply tell her, I've been triggered, this thing really upset me, and I'm just letting you know I'm kind of effed up right now, and I need you to be a little patient with me because I'm having a hard time watching my tongue. But in an ideal world, you would anticipate the trigger. You would know, okay, we're going to go do this thing now, and sometimes that triggers me, and so I'm going to be on alert walking into this situation knowing that I'm at risk of being triggered. So the trigger journal is most effective in that you can anticipate things that might be said or done that would trigger you, and if possible, avoid it altogether. You want to write down the triggers, and then you would want to look for themes amongst those triggers. So, for example, if he had 10 things in his journal that were triggers, it wouldn't take much of an investigator to realize, okay, well, these 3 are similar, and those 4 are similar, and these 2 are similar. So even though they would be separate incidents, if you looked a little deeper, you would realize it was only maybe 3 triggers.